It is hard to admit, but the world has always been a little scared of India's progress. Remember the 18th century, Indian muslin from Bengal was so fine, so light, so far ahead of anything Europe could produce, that British traders called it woven air. Instead of celebrating that craftsmanship, the British Empire crushed it. Weavers had their thumbs cut, import taxes were slapped on Indian cloth entering Britain, while Indian ports were forced open for British mill cloth. The fear was not about fabric. The fear was about what India could become if that industry was allowed to grow on its own terms. Remember the 1990s, when Indian engineers began solving the Y2K problem for companies across the world? The reaction abroad was not admiration first, it was suspicion. Analysts openly wondered whether India was stealing jobs that belonged to the West. Contracts were delayed, visa rules were tightened, yet the work did not stop. In that decade, quietly built the foundation for India's technology story on the global stage. Remember the 1970s Green Revolution, when India moved from being a nation dependent on imported grain to a country capable of feeding itself. Several Western agricultural exporters lobbied their own governments to slow down technology transfer to Indian farmers. The fear was never really about wheat or rice. The fear was about a billion-plus population becoming self-sufficient instead of dependent. This is a pattern worth noticing. Whenever India builds something on its own terms, the world often reacts erratically. And in 2026, the same pattern is repeating, this time over something every single Indian uses every day, the Unified Payments Interface, UPI. 2 days ago, the Lok Sabha passed a law called the Taxation and Other Laws Bill. On the surface, it looks like a routine financial law, but buried inside it is a quiet change that could reshape how every Indian pays for everything, from a cup of chai to a car. So the question this video is going to answer is simple. Why is the world, and specifically the United States, so uncomfortable with India's UPI? And is this new law a sign that India has been pressurized from the India-United States trade deal? Before answering that, everyone watching needs to understand what UPI actually broke, because that is exactly what threatened the old system. Think about any digital payment as a journey. Money has to travel from one bank account to another, safely and instantly. That journey needs a network to carry it, protection to secure it, and infrastructure to run it. Before UPI, that journey ran almost entirely through global card networks, the Visa and Mastercard kind, along with the banks and processors sitting in between. Every time someone swiped a card in India, a small percentage of that transaction, called the Merchant Discount Rate, or MDR, was quietly deducted. That MDR did not go to one company. It got split 4 ways. A part went to the bank that issued the card, called the interchange fee. A part went to the card network for keeping the transaction secure. A part went to the payment processor that ran the machine or the app in the background. And a part went to the government as tax. So if a shopkeeper billed 1,000 rupees, about $10.50, the shopkeeper did not actually receive the full 1,000. After all 4 cuts, something closer to 980 rupees, about $10.29, would land in that account. Multiply that across an economy the size of India's, and that gap becomes an enormous number, most of it flowing out to foreign card networks and foreign linked payment companies. In 2020, the government of India made a decision that quietly ended this. MDR charges were legally banned on UPI transactions and on RuPay debit cards. From that point on, when an Indian paid a merchant through UPI, the entire amount reached the merchant. Zero cut, zero leakage. This is the single decision that turned UPI from a convenient app into a financial revolution. It is also the decision that started making foreign payment companies distinctly uncomfortable. Think about what this meant for the smallest shopkeeper in the country. None of them could realistically justify paying card machine fees on a 50 rupee, about 52 cents transaction. Before UPI, that entire segment of the economy simply stayed in cash, invisible to formal banking, invisible to credit systems, invisible to growth. UPI did not just save money on fees, it pulled tens of millions of small merchants into the formal digital economy for the first time in their lives. That is the real achievement hiding behind this fee debate, and it is worth remembering every time this story gets reduced to a simple percentage point. Foreign payment companies were collectively estimated to be earning close to 100 crore rupees, about $10.5 million, A year from India through these charges before UPI scaled up. That flow slowed dramatically once MDR disappeared on UPI. India built RuPay as its own domestic card network, specifically so that the country was not depending entirely on foreign-owned security and settlement infrastructure for its own payments. And to encourage adoption, MDR was waived on RuPay debit cards too. There is one more decision that added fuel here. RuPay credit cards were deliberately linked into UPI, allowing people to use a RuPay credit card directly through apps like the ones millions of Indians open every single day. But other credit card networks were not given that same access. Foreign companies flagged this loudly as discriminatory. India's answer, in effect, was that a country is allowed to build and favor its own financial infrastructure. Now here is where this story gets serious. In March 2026, the United States government released a trade report that explicitly named India's digital payment system as a barrier to trade. It flagged the zero MDR policy on UPI and RuPay. It flagged the RuPay-UPI credit card linkage. It called these practices an unfair disadvantage for American payment companies operating in India. Few days ago, in August 2026 itself, the very month the Indian Parliament's House session began, the government passed a law removing the legal protection that had guaranteed zero MDR on UPI and RuPay debit cards forever. That protection is now gone. It does not mean charges are being added immediately. It means charges can legally be introduced at any point in the future. A report from the United States in March, a law removing protection in August. The opposition in the Lok Sabha did not hold back, directly asking whether this law was a concession made to secure the India-United States trade deal. The government's official response is that UPI has grown so massive that it now genuinely needs new investment, more data centers, stronger infrastructure, a network that does not buckle under its own success. To fund that, some charges may eventually be introduced, and the government has stated clearly that any future MDR charges will apply to merchants, not to the ordinary person tapping pay on their phone. It has also said UPI will remain completely free for peer-to-peer transfers between individuals, like sending money to a friend or a family member. When a merchant is charged a fee, that merchant does not quietly absorb it. That cost finds its way back to the customer, one way or another. So while the announcement technically protects the individual on paper, the lived reality for the common Indian could look very different. Financial analysts tracking this closely estimate the eventual MDR on UPI. I could land somewhere between 0.05% and 0.07%, while RuPay debit cards could see something closer to 0.15 to 0.2%. Some estimates suggest this would only apply to transactions above 2,000 rupees, about $21, and only for merchants crossing an annual turnover of around 1.5 crore rupees, about $157,000. Nothing is locked in yet, but the door is now open. Pause on that for a second. That is billions of rupees that used to leave the Indian economy every year through foreign card networks and foreign payment processors, now staying inside India's own financial system instead. That single decision in 2020 quietly redirected an enormous amount of money back into the domestic economy, and it happened without a single headline calling it a trade war win, even though functionally that is exactly what it was. In the financial year ending in 2026, UPI processed over 24 crore transactions, or 240 million transactions, worth more than 300 lakh crore rupees, about $3.15 trillion. That is not a typo, 300 lakh crore. This is one of the largest digital payment ecosystems on the planet, built inside a single decade, running almost entirely on infrastructure India designed for itself. And that scale is exactly why the government has said the subsidy it pays to support UPI's zero-cost model needs rethinking. From 2021, that subsidy rose steadily from around 1,300 crore rupees, about $136.5 million, to 3,600 crore rupees, about $378 million by 2024, tracking the explosive growth in usage. But in the February 2026 budget, that subsidy was actually reduced to 2,000 crore rupees, about $210 million, with the government signaling plainly that it does not intend to keep footing the entire bill on its own. So here is a fair question. Should a system this successful still be run entirely on taxpayer subsidy? Or does it need a sustainable funding model of its own? This is genuinely one of the more interesting policy debates in India right now, and everyone watching should have an opinion on it. Now, here is the part of the story that turns this from a policy analysis into a geopolitical story. Two of India's most used UPI apps are Google Pay and PhonePe. Both operate through companies with significant American ownership, PhonePe through Walmart and Google Pay through Alphabet. Combined foreign-owned platforms have handled somewhere close to 80% of UPI transaction volume in recent years. Back in 2020, the National Payments Corporation of India set a rule that no single UPI app should be allowed to control more than 30% of transaction volume, specifically to prevent this kind of concentration in foreign hands. The original deadline to enforce this was January 2023. That deadline has already been pushed once, all the way to December 2026, precisely while the India-United States trade negotiations have been playing out in the background. Connect the dots here. A cap that was supposed to reduce foreign control over India's own payment rails has been delayed for years, right as trade talks with the very country whose companies dominate that market have been ongoing. That is not a coincidence anyone should ignore, and UPI is not the only friction point sitting inside this trade deal. Reports suggest ethanol policy is another unresolved sticking point, along with ongoing disagreements around dairy and automobile market access. India is not just negotiating one issue with the United States. It is negotiating on multiple fronts at once, and UPI happens to be one of the loudest. India is not the only country facing this exact playbook. Look at Brazil. Brazil built its own instant payment system called Pix, designed the same way UPI was, low cost, fast, and built to include as many people as possible without foreign intermediaries taking a cut. The United States objected, claiming Pix discriminated against American payment companies. When Brazil did not change course, the United States imposed a 25% tariff, explicitly tied to this dispute. This is not an isolated case. According to reports from the United States Trade Representative's own office, similar pressure has been applied to Indonesia, Vietnam, and Turkey. Even Gulf countries that maintain close security ties with the United States have not been spared, with reports of pressure applied to Saudi Arabia and Qatar over trade practices. And China, of course, remains locked in its own much larger tariff standoff with the United States. The pattern across every one of these countries is identical. A nation builds financial or digital infrastructure that keeps money and control inside its own borders. The United States flags it as an unfair trade practice. Pressure follows, sometimes through reports, sometimes through tariffs, sometimes through trade deal terms. What makes India's case different is scale. Brazil's Pix is impressive, but UPI processes transaction volumes several multiples larger. Indonesia and Vietnam's digital payment systems are still growing into regional players. India's UPI has already become the reference model that other developing nations study and try to copy, from parts of Africa to the Gulf to Southeast Asia. When a system becomes the global benchmark for how digital payments should work, and it was built without depending on Visa, Mastercard, or any single foreign infrastructure provider, that is not just a trade irritant anymore. That is a demonstration that a country outside the traditional financial powers can design, scale, and own the entire stack itself. That demonstration effect is arguably what worries policymakers in Washington far more than the actual rupee figure lost on merchant fees. So here's the real question this video wants every Indian to sit with. Is India simply the latest country to get this treatment, or is there something different happening here because of the sheer scale of UPI? Because here is what should make every Indian proud instead of anxious. UPI is not a small experiment that the world is nervous about by accident. It is the world's most successful example of a country building its own financial infrastructure at massive scale that genuinely serves its own citizens first. That is precisely why global powers are paying this much attention to it. Nobody spends this much energy pressuring a system that does not matter. The Global Trade Research Initiative, a respected New Delhi-based think tank, has already urged the government not to bend on UPI policy simply because of trade deal pressure. Their analysis is straightforward. Every time the United States has pushed another country on a domestic digital payment system, that country was made to give up ground gradually. First a report, then a deadline delay, then a law change, then an actual charge. Their message to India is to hold its position, because sovereignty over financial infrastructure is not something that should be traded away for short-term trade concessions. This is not just a think tank's opinion. This is a genuinely difficult balancing act for any government to manage. On one side sits a trade relationship worth negotiating carefully, with dairy, automobiles, and ethanol all sitting on the same table as UPI. On the other side sits a payment system that over 1 billion people now depend on every single day, one that has become a symbol of what a developing country can build without outside help. Whatever decision the government eventually takes on UPI will not just be a financial decision. It will be read around the world as a signal of how far India is willing to bend under external pressure and how far it is willing to stand its ground. And this is where the conversation becomes bigger than a bill in the Lok Sabha. This is about whether India controls the digital rails its own economy runs on, or whether that control quietly shifts elsewhere because of pressure applied from outside. UPI is not just a convenience app. It is critical financial infrastructure, and control over critical infrastructure is control over the future of an economy. The government has said, and this needs to be said plainly, that whatever changes eventually come to MDR charges, the individual using UPI to pay a friend or a shopkeeper will not personally see charges appear on their own transactions. That commitment matters, and it should be tracked closely as this policy develops over the coming months. What every Indian should watch for now is simple: how much any future merchant side charge actually is, who it applies to, and whether that 30% foreign ownership cap on UPI apps is actually enforced when December 2026 finally arrives, or whether that deadline quietly moves again. Here is something every Indian should genuinely feel proud about. In less than a decade, this country built a payment system so effective, so widely adopted, and so financially disruptive that it forced the world's largest economy to write formal trade reports about it. Muslin from Bengal was banned from British markets because it was better than what Britain could make. UPI is now facing global pressure for the exact same reason, because it is better, cheaper, and more inclusive than what came before it, and it was built entirely on Indian terms. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And it is a pattern worth remembering every time India builds something the world was not expecting. Should India hold firm on UPI and resist trade pressure completely, even if it means friction in the broader trade deal? Or should India accept limited merchant side charges now to secure a bigger trade agreement later? This debate is only going to get louder over the coming months. There is also a lesson here that goes beyond payments. Every single time India has built something meant to serve its own people first, whether it was vaccine manufacturing during the pandemic, space missions run on a fraction of the budget of other space agencies, or a payment system that made banking accessible to a street vendor, the international reaction has followed the same 3 stages. First, disbelief that it can be done at all. Second, quiet concern once it clearly works. Third, active pressure once it starts working at a scale nobody outside the country anticipated. UPI is currently sitting exactly at that third stage, and that is precisely why this story deserves far more attention than a 2-line mention in the business news. If this breakdown helped make sense, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this channel for the next update the moment there is real clarity on how this new law is implemented. Because this story is not over. It has only just begun.